The crystal chandelier hanging in the center of the Grand Imperial Hotel's lobby was large enough to crush a small car, and right now, Keisha felt as though the weight of it was resting directly on her chest. She tugged self-consciously at the hem of her stiff white dress, which felt like cardboard against her skin, and adjusted the bright red vest that marked her as the newest and lowest-ranking member of the service staff. It was only her third hour on the floor, and the humidity of the city outside was nothing compared to the stifling pressure inside these gold-gilded walls. The hotel was a fortress of wealth, a place where the carpet was so thick it swallowed the sound of footsteps and the air smelled perpetually of fresh lilies and old money. Keisha needed this job. Her student loans were a noose that tightened a little more every month, and her grandmother's medical bills were beginning to pile up on the kitchen counter like a monument to their poverty. She kept her head down, polishing a brass railing that was already gleaming, trying to make herself invisible. Standing near the concierge desk was Manager Preston, a man whose suit cost more than Keisha's entire life's earnings. He was a tall, skeletal figure with eyes like polished flint and a mouth that seemed permanently pursed as if he had just tasted something sour. Preston didn't manage the staff, he terrorized them. He moved through the lobby like a shark in a coral reef, looking for weakness. Posture, people, posture, he hissed as he glided past Keisha, not even looking at her, treating her as a piece of furniture that had been slightly misaligned. Keisha straightened her spine until it cracked, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She watched as Preston descended upon a bellboy for having a scuff on his shoe, his voice a low, venomous drone that made the young man tremble. This was the ecosystem of the Grand Imperial. The strong devoured the weak, and appearance was the only currency that mattered. If you didn't look like you belonged, you were treated like an infection that needed to be purged. It was into this atmosphere of high tension and superficial perfection that the revolving doors spun slowly, admitting a blast of hot, humid air from the street and a figure that made the entire lobby freeze. He was an old man, stooped and fragile, clutching a plastic bag that looked as though it had been reused 100 times. His suit was a disastrous shade of charcoal gray, frayed at the cuffs and stained at the lapel, hanging loosely off his thin frame like skin on a skeleton. He wore battered sneakers instead of dress shoes, and his hair was a tuft of white chaos. He looked less like a guest and more like a specter of the poverty the hotel worked so hard to keep outside its gates. He stood on the marble floor, blinking confusedly at the overwhelming brilliance of the chandelier, clutching a crumpled piece of paper in his trembling hand. To Keisha, he looked like her grandfather before the dementia took him, lost, harmless, and desperately in need of kindness. But to Manager Preston, the old man was a stain on a masterpiece. Preston stopped midway through berating the bellboy. His head snapped toward the entrance, his nostrils flaring as if he could physically smell the lack of wealth on the new arrival. The silence in the lobby was absolute. Guests in silk gowns and tailored tuxedos stopped their conversations, holding champagne flutes halfway to their lips, staring with open disdain at the intruder. The old man took a tentative step forward, his sneakers squeaking loudly on the polished stone. He looked around, his eyes scanning the faces of the staff, searching for an anchor in the sea of judgment. When his eyes landed on Preston, he offered a weak, hopeful smile and held out the crumpled paper. It was a gesture of trust, a plea for assistance, but Preston did not see a human being. He saw a problem to be eliminated. The manager straightened his silk tie, his face hardening into a mask of cruel authority, and began to march across the lobby with the purposeful stride of an executioner. Keisha felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. She gripped her polishing rag, her knuckles turning white, knowing that something terrible was about to happen, and knowing that she was powerless to stop it. The confrontation began not with a question, but with an accusation. Manager Preston stopped 3 feet from the old man, maintaining a sanitary distance as if poverty were contagious. He didn't look at the paper the man was offering. He looked down his aquiline nose, his voice projecting clearly across the cavernous space so that every wealthy guest could witness his efficiency. "Delivery entrance is in the alley," Preston announced, his tone clipped and cold. "We do not allow soliciting in the main lobby. You need to leave." Immediately, the old man blinked, his smile faltering but not disappearing. He didn't seem to understand the words, but he understood the tone. He shook his head vigorously, stepping forward again, thrusting the paper toward Preston with urgency. He spoke then, his voice raspy and dry, the words tumbling out in a language that sounded full of hard consonants and soft vowels. It wasn't English. It was a desperate stream of Korean, spoken with a dialect that sounded rural and thick. Ani, the old man said, pointing at the paper and then at the floor. Yogi. Adur. Waiting, he tapped his chest and then mimed a height with his hand, trying to communicate through charades what he couldn't say with words. Preston recoiled, brushing his suit jacket as if the man's words had physically touched him. I do not speak gibberish, Preston sneered, his volume rising. And I certainly do not have time for vagrants playing games. This is a 5-star establishment, not a homeless shelter. Security. The word cracked like a whip. 2 burly men in dark suits detached themselves from the shadows near the elevators and began to move in. The old man's eyes widened in panic. He clutched the plastic bag to his chest, backing away, continuing to speak in rapid, pleading Korean. He was saying something about a reservation, about a meeting, but to the ears of the hotel staff and the wealthy patrons, it was just noise. Keisha watched from her station near the brass planters, her heart breaking. She knew that look of frustration. She had seen it on her grandmother's face when she tried to navigate the healthcare system, the look of someone who knows they are right but lacks the power to prove it. The guests were beginning to titter, whispering behind their hands, amused by the spectacle. How did he even get past the doorman? A woman in emerald silk whispered loudly. It's disgraceful. Preston, emboldened by the audience, stepped closer, invading the old man's personal space to intimidate him. I said get out, Preston growled, pointing a manicured finger toward the revolving doors. Before I have you thrown into the gutter where you belong, the old man wasn't moving fast enough for Preston's liking. The manager reached out and slapped the paper from the old man's hand. It fluttered to the marble floor, landing face down. The old man let out a small, pained cry and bent to retrieve it, his knees cracking audibly. It was a moment of supreme humiliation, a powerful man forcing a weak one to his knees. The cruelty of the action sent a shockwave through Keisha. It wasn't just rude, it was inhumane. The fear of losing her job, the fear of her student loans, the fear of being unable to pay the rent, all of it was suddenly outweighed by a burning, righteous anger. She looked at the red vest she was wearing, the uniform that was supposed to make her servile, and felt a surge of defiance. She couldn't watch this. She couldn't stand by and let this man be treated like garbage just because his suit was old and his English was broken. She took a breath, a deep, steadying inhale that smelled of lilies and injustice, and she let go of the brass railing. Her feet moved before her brain could talk her out of it. The click of her sensible work shoes on the marble sounded like gunshots in the quiet lobby as she abandoned her post and walked straight into the center of the conflict. Manager Preston was looming over the crouching figure of the old man, signaling the security guards to grab him, when a clear, steady voice cut through the tension. Jamkin Manio, Keisha said. The word hung in the air, alien and unexpected. Preston froze, his head whipping around to see who had dared to interrupt him. He looked at Keisha, his eyes narrowing in confusion and rage, seeing only the new girl, the nobody in the white dress and red vest. But the effect on the old man was instantaneous. He stopped reaching for the paper and looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief. He looked at Keisha as if she were an angel descending from the chandelier. Keisha stepped between the security guards and the old man, planting her feet firmly. She looked down at him, her expression softening into one of profound respect. Gwenchan Yuzio, Harabiaji, she asked gently. Are you okay, grandfather? The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the shock of the onlookers. A waitress, a black woman in a service uniform, speaking fluent, tender Korean to a vagrant. Preston's face turned a shade of mottled red. What do you think you are doing? He hissed, stepping toward her. Get back to your station, or you can join this trash on the street. Keisha ignored him. She focused entirely on the old man. She knelt down, disregarding the rule about staff never sitting or kneeling in the lobby, and helped him pick up the crumpled paper. The old man's hands were shaking, his skin like parchment paper, dry and cool. He grabbed her hand with surprising strength, his eyes welling with tears. "Gamsahamnida," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Thank you." No one. No one listened. Keisha smiled at him, a genuine, warm smile that illuminated her face. "I'm listening," she said in Korean. "Tell me what you need." She had learned the language years ago, working in a bodega in Queens owned by the Kim family. Mrs. Kim had treated her like a daughter, teaching her the language while they stocked shelves, sharing stories of her homeland. Keisha had absorbed it all, the rhythm, the honorifics, the heart of the culture. It was a skill she hid, usually irrelevant in her world, but now it was a shield. The old man poured out his story in a rush of words. He wasn't a beggar. He was a father. He had traveled halfway across the world to meet his son. His son, who had been estranged for years, had sent for him, telling him to meet at this hotel. The paper was the confirmation number for the penthouse suite. Keisha stood up, the paper in her hand. She turned to face Preston, her fear replaced by a cold resolve. She held the paper out, not with the trembling hesitation of the old man, but with the steady authority of someone holding the truth. "He isn't a vagrant, sir," Keisha said, her voice projecting to the guests watching. "He is a guest. He has a confirmation number for the penthouse suite. He is waiting for his son." The revelation rippled through the crowd. Whispers of surprise exchanged between the wealthy patrons. But Manager Preston did not look at the paper Keisha held out with the authority of a judge presenting a verdict. Instead, he looked at her hand as if it were covered in filth. He let out a short, sharp laugh that sounded like glass breaking, a sound devoid of humor and filled entirely with incredulity. To him, the idea that this shuffling, disheveled old man could afford a cup of coffee in the lobby, let alone the penthouse suite, the crown jewel of the Grand Imperial, reserved for royalty and tech moguls, was not just impossible, it was offensive. It was a lie so bold it insulted his intelligence. He snatched the paper from Keisha's hand, not to read it, but to crumple it into a tight ball in his fist. "You are delusional," Preston spat, his voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet register that was far more terrifying than his shouting. "And you are fired. Get your things. Get out." Now, he didn't even look at the confirmation number. He didn't need to. In his world, truth was determined by appearance, and the man on the floor failed the test. Keisha felt the blood drain from her face, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Fired. The word echoed in her mind, carrying with it the terrifying weight of consequences, the eviction notice, the unpaid tuition, the medication her grandmother needed to breathe. But as she looked down at the old man, who was now trembling violently, clutching the hem of her white dress like a lifeline, the fear of poverty was eclipsed by a fierce, protective instinct. She couldn't leave him. If she left now, the security guards would drag him into the alley like a bag of trash. "I'm not leaving until he is safe," Keisha said, her voice shaking, but her feet planted firmly on the marble. "And you are making a mistake. A massive mistake. Look at the paper, Preston." Just look at it. Her use of his first name, stripped of the honorific manager, made the veins in Preston's neck bulge. He turned to the security guards, his face twisted into a mask of pure malice. "Remove them both," he ordered. "Throw them in the street. If they resist, call the police and have them arrested for trespassing." The two guards, large men with faces of stone who were paid not to ask questions, stepped forward. One of them reached for the old man's arm, his grip rough and unyielding. The old man cried out, a high, thin sound of pain that cut through the murmuring of the wealthy guests. "Hajima! Hajima!" he pleaded, shrinking back. Keisha moved instantly, slapping the guard's hand away with a resounding crack that silenced the lobby. "Don't you touch him," she screamed, her voice raw with emotion. "He is a human being. What is wrong with you people?" The guests gasped. A waitress striking security? It was mutiny. It was chaos. Preston looked as though he was about to have an apoplexy. "Grab her," he shrieked, losing his composure entirely. "Drag her up by her hair if you have to." The violence in the air was palpable, a physical weight pressing down on them. Keisha backed up, shielding the old man with her body, bracing herself for the impact, knowing she was about to be hurt, knowing she had lost everything, but unable to step aside. She closed her eyes, preparing for the rough hands of the guards, whispering a soft reassurance to the old man in Korean, telling him she wouldn't let them take him. The violence Keisha anticipated never came. Instead, the atmosphere in the room shifted so abruptly it was as if the air pressure had dropped before a tornado. The revolving doors at the front of the lobby didn't just spin. They were held open by men in dark sunglasses who moved with the precision of a paramilitary unit. The humid air of the city didn't rush in this time. It was kept at bay by the sheer freezing intensity of the group that entered. A hush fell over the Grand Imperial, a silence far deeper and more fearful than the one that had greeted the old man. Even the chandeliers seemed to stop swaying. Through the open doors walked a phalanx of 6 men, all wearing black suits that were cut sharp enough to bleed on. They were not hotel security. They were something else entirely. They moved in a V formation, clearing a path through the lobby with nothing but their presence. Guests who had been sneering moments ago now shrank back, clutching their pearls and champagne, instinctively recognizing a predator that was far higher on the food chain than they were. At the point of the V walked a man who radiated power like heat from a furnace. He was young, perhaps in his early 30s, but his eyes held the cold, hard stare of someone who had seen and ordered terrible things. He wore a navy blue suit that likely cost more than the hotel's annual renovation budget, tailored to perfection over a lean, muscular frame. His hair was slicked back, revealing a sharp, angular face that was handsome in a terrifying way. On his wrist, a diamond-encrusted watch glinted under the lights, and on his finger sat a heavy onyx ring. This was Junho Park, a man whose name was whispered in fear across the city's underworld, a man who controlled shipping lanes, real estate, and shadows. But right now, he wasn't looking at the architecture or the guests. His dark eyes were scanning the room with the intensity of a laser, looking for something specific. Manager Preston, who had been moments away from physically assaulting Keisha, froze. He turned toward the entrance, his mouth half open, his anger instantly replaced by a dawn of confusion, and then, slowly, recognition. He didn't know exactly who this man was, but he knew wealth and he knew power. He adjusted his tie reflexively, his bully persona dissolving into the obsequious servant he played for the rich. He took a step forward, a practiced, oily smile plastering itself onto his face, ready to greet this VIP. But Junho didn't even see him. Junho's gaze swept past the manager, past the fountain, and locked onto the scene near the elevators. The 2 security guards looming aggressively, the young waitress in the red vest standing defiantly with her arms spread, and behind her, the cowering, weeping figure in the gray rags. The change in Junho's expression was terrifying. The cool detachment vanished, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated shock that quickly morphed into a rage so profound it made the air feel thin. He stopped walking. His entourage stopped instantly, their hands drifting toward the inside of their jackets. The silence in the lobby was so absolute that the squeak of the old man's sneaker was audible. Junho let out a breath, a sharp hiss of air, and then he moved. He didn't walk. He stormed across the marble floor, his strides long and purposeful. The sound of his dress shoes striking the stone was a rhythmic drumbeat of impending doom. Preston, misreading the situation entirely and assuming the VIP was offended by the sight of the vagrant, rushed to intercept him. Sir, I apologize for the disturbance," Preston stammered, holding up his hands. "We're handling the trash right now. Security is just removing these." Junho didn't break stride. He didn't even look at Preston. He simply extended one arm and shoved the manager aside with such force that Preston stumbled backward and fell hard onto his backside, sliding across the polished floor. The gasp from the crowd was audible. Junho ignored it all. He reached the security guards, who looked at him with uncertainty. "Back," Junho commanded. The word was spoken in English, quiet and lethal. The guards, sensing the danger radiating from this man, immediately released their grip and stepped back, hands raised. Junho dropped to his knees. He didn't care about his suit pants. He didn't care about the audience. He fell to his knees on the hard marble in front of the old man, his face crumbling from anger into agonizing relief. "Abioji," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Father." The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. The vagrant in the dirty gray suit looked up, his tear-streaked face breaking into a wobbly smile of recognition. "Junhoya," the old man sobbed, reaching out with his shaking hands to cup the younger man's face. The feared crime boss, the man who made grown men tremble, leaned into his father's touch, closing his eyes as a single tear escaped and tracked down his cheek. It was a moment of raw, unfiltered humanity amidst the artificial glamour of the hotel. Keisha, still standing guard, felt her knees go weak with relief. She stepped back slightly, giving them space, but remained close. The father began to speak rapidly in Korean, his voice thick with emotion, pointing at his torn plastic bag, then at the security guards, and finally, pointing an accusing finger at Preston, who was scrambling to his feet, his face the color of ash. Junho listened, his head bowed, nodding as his father spoke. The old man's voice rose and fell, recounting the humiliation, the rejection, the fear. And then, the father's hand moved. He pointed at Keisha. His tone changed. It became soft, grateful. He mimed the action of her standing in front of him. He tapped his heart. Kansa, he said. Angel. He looked at his son and nodded vigorously, patting Keisha's hand where it hung by her side. Junho looked up then. He looked at Keisha. The coldness was gone from his eyes, replaced by a look of intense, piercing assessment. He saw the cheap uniform, the tired eyes, the defiant stance she had taken to protect his father. He stood up slowly, helping his father to his feet with infinite gentleness, dusting off the old man's jacket with his own hands. Then he turned to face the room. The transformation was instant. The loving son vanished, and the monster returned. Junho turned slowly to face manager Preston. The silence in the lobby was suffocating. Preston was standing now, brushing off his trousers, trying to regain some shred of dignity, but his hands were shaking uncontrollably. He knew. Everyone in the room knew. He had just assaulted the father of a man who looked like he owned the city. Junho walked toward Preston, his movements slow and predatory. You, Junho said, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. You called my father trash. Preston swallowed hard, his atoms apple-bobbing. Sir, I didn't know, he squeaked, his voice pitching high with terror. He didn't have identification. He looked. The dress code. It was a misunderstanding. A terrible misunderstanding. Preston looked around for support, but the wealthy guests had turned their backs, dissociating themselves from the sinking ship. I was just following protocol, Preston pleaded, sweat beading on his forehead. I am the manager. It is my job to keep the hotel. Orderly. Orderly, Junho repeated, tasting the word like it was poison. He stopped inches from Preston's face, invading the manager's personal space with a terrifying intimacy. The scent of expensive cologne that Preston wore like armor seemed to turn sour in the air, overpowered by the sheer metallic aura of danger radiating from Junho. Orderly, Junho whispered, the words slicing through the silence like a scalpel. You think throwing an 80-year-old man onto the street is orderly? You think stripping a human being of his dignity because his jacket is old is protocol? Junho reached out, his hand moving so fast Preston flinched, expecting a blow. But Junho didn't strike him. Instead, he reached out and gently took hold of the lapel of Preston's expensive Italian suit. He rubbed the fabric between his thumb and forefinger, feeling the quality, the texture of wealth. This is just wool and silk, Junho said, his voice rising loud enough for the entire lobby to hear. It burns just as easily as rags. It rots just as fast in the grave. You think this makes you important? You think this makes you better than him? He shoved Preston backward again, releasing the lapel with a gesture of disgust. Preston stumbled, his composure completely shattered. He looked around the lobby, his eyes darting frantically to the guests, begging for someone to intervene, to validate his authority. But the guests were statues, frozen by the spectacle of raw power dismantling hollow bureaucracy. I demand you leave, Preston tried to say, but his voice was a broken wheeze. Security. Call the police. The two security guards, who had previously been ready to manhandle the old man, didn't twitch a muscle. They were looking at Junho's entourage, at the bulges under their jackets, and they made the smart calculation to stay very, very still. Junho laughed, a dark, humorless sound. The police, he asked. Go ahead. Call them. Or better yet, let me make a call. He held out his hand without looking back, and one of his men instantly placed a sleek black smartphone into his palm. Junho tapped the screen once, bringing the phone to his ear, his eyes never leaving Preston's trembling face. Chairman Rossi, Junho said into the phone, the name causing a ripple of recognition among the staff. It was the name of the hotel's owner, a man who lived in Switzerland and was rarely seen. It's Park. Yes. I'm in your lobby. I'm looking at your general manager. He just assaulted my father. There was a pause, a silence during which Preston's skin turned a translucent shade of gray. No, Junho continued, his voice bored. I don't want an apology. I want him gone. Now. Or I pull my funding for the expansion in Macau, and I buy this building just to turn it into a parking lot. He listened for another second, then pulled the phone away from his ear and held it out toward Preston. He wants to speak to you. Preston took the phone with shaking hands, looking like he was holding a live grenade. And Mr. Chairman, he stammered. The voice on the other end was loud enough for Keisha to hear from where she stood. It was a stream of furious invective, a dismissal so absolute and brutal that it felt like a physical beating. Preston flinched with every word, his posture collapsing, shrinking into himself until he looked smaller than the old man he had tried to evict. You're fired, the voice on the phone screamed. Get out of my hotel before I have you arrested for liability. Preston lowered the phone, the call ended. He looked up at Junho, tears of humiliation welling in his eyes. He had lost everything in the span of 5 minutes. His career, his status, his power, all stripped away because he had judged a book by its cover. Junho stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. Get out, he said. And if I ever see you near my father or this woman again, the police will be the least of your worries. Preston didn't wait. He turned and ran, his expensive shoes slipping on the marble, fleeing the lobby in disgrace, the heavy revolving doors spinning behind him like a closing chapter. With the toxicity of Preston removed, the atmosphere in the lobby instantly transformed. The tension evaporated, replaced by a profound, reverent silence. Junho turned his back on the fleeing manager as if he no longer existed and focused his entire attention on the two people left standing near the brass planters, his father and Keisha. The transition in his demeanor was jarring. The predator vanished and the gentleman appeared. He walked over to Keisha, who was still standing protectively near the old man, her hands clasped in front of her red vest, her heart rate slowly returning to normal. She felt suddenly incredibly self-conscious. She was just a waitress, a nobody with debt and a grandmother to care for, and she had just been at the center of a Mafia power play. She moved to step away, to fade back into the background where staff were supposed to be, but the old man caught her hand. Gajima, the father said softly. Don't go. He looked at his son and gestured to Keisha, speaking rapidly in Korean again. He told Junho about the water, about the kindness, about how she had stood between him and the guards when everyone else had laughed. He told him how she spoke their language, how she had called him grandfather. Junho listened, his expression softening with every word. He looked at Keisha, really looked at her, seeing past the uniform. He saw the frayed edges of her sleeves, the fatigue in her eyes, the quiet strength in her posture. He saw someone who knew what it was like to struggle and had chosen kindness over safety. Junho bowed. It wasn't a nod, it was a deep, formal bow from the waist, a sign of supreme respect that sent a shockwave through the watching staff. A man of his stature bowing to a waitress was unheard of. I am in your debt, Junho said, his English perfect, his voice rich and sincere. My father. He has dementia. He wanders sometimes. He remembered this hotel from a trip we took 20 years ago. I was terrified I had lost him. He straightened up, his dark eyes locking onto hers. You saved him. You protected him when no one else would. You saw a human being where others saw a nuisance. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, heavy and black with gold lettering and a pen. He wrote something on the back of it swiftly. What is your name? He asked. Keisha, she whispered. Keisha Williams, Junho nodded. Keisha, you are no longer a waitress here. Unless you want to be, he handed her the card. My family honors its debts. You have financial burdens? School? Family? Keisha nodded, tears pricking her eyes. My grandmother. And student loans. Junho didn't smile, but his eyes were kind. Consider them handled. All of them. And consider this a job offer. I need people with your integrity. People who are brave enough to do what is right, not what is easy. He turned to his father, wrapping an arm around the old man's shoulders. Come, Abioji. Let's get you some food. The old man patted Keisha's cheek one last time, beaming. Gamoo, Agassi, he said. Thank you, young lady. As they walked away, surrounded by their security detail, the lobby remained silent. Keisha looked down at the card in her hand. On the back, Junho had written a number and a single phrase, loyalty is rare. Name your price. She looked up, watching them disappear into the elevator that led to the penthouse. The other staff members were staring at her, some with jealousy, some with awe. But Keisha didn't feel like the waitress in the stiff white dress anymore. She took a deep breath, the air smelling of lilies and, for the first time in a long time, hope. She untied her red vest, folded it neatly over the brass railing, and walked toward the exit. She had a phone call to make to her grandmother. 5 years later, the Grand Imperial Hotel was hosting its annual charity gala, a night where the city's elite gathered to flaunt their wealth under the guise of philanthropy. The chandelier was the same, the marble floors were just as polished, but the atmosphere was different. There was a warmth to the service, a diversity in the staff, a sense of humanity that hadn't existed before. At the center table, near the stage, sat Junho Park, looking older, more settled, his sharp edges smoothed by time. Next to him sat his father, frail now but happy, dressed in a suit that fit perfectly. And standing at the podium, addressing the room, was the guest of honor. She wore a gown of deep emerald green that complemented her skin perfectly, her hair styled in elegant braids. She radiated confidence and authority, commanding the attention of every CEO and dignitary in the room. It was Keisha. But she wasn't a waitress. She was the director of the Han Park Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to providing legal aid and healthcare advocacy for the elderly and immigrant communities in the city. She had finished her law degree 3 years ago, paid for in full by the Park family, and had dedicated her life to fighting the very systems that had once tried to crush her and the old man. Justice, Keisha said into the microphone, her voice clear and resonant, is not about the clothes you wear or the language you speak. It is about the ability to see the humanity in the person standing in front of you. She looked down at the table where Junho and his father sat. The old man waved at her, a napkin tucked into his collar, his smile as bright as it had been that day in the lobby. Junho raised his glass in a silent toast, a look of profound pride on his face. He had kept his promise. He had cleared her debts, paid for her grandmother's surgeries, and given her the platform to change the world. But she had given him something far greater. She had given him back his father, and she had reminded him that even in a world of wolves, there were still angels. Keisha smiled back, her eyes scanning the back of the room. There, by the kitchen doors, she saw a young busboy nervously adjusting his tie, looking overwhelmed by the grandeur of the event. He dropped a fork, the metal clattering loudly on the floor. A guest at a nearby table turned to scold him, but Keisha paused her speech. It's all right, she said warmly through the microphone, addressing the boy directly. We've all been there. Take your time, the guest closed his mouth. The busboy looked up at her, gratitude washing over his face. Keisha knew that look. She carried it in her heart every day. The cycle of cruelty had been broken that day in the lobby, replaced by a legacy of understanding. And as the applause rose, filling the cavernous room, Keisha knew that the old man in the gray suit hadn't just been a guest, he had been her destiny.